Oh, could you introduce yourself and just briefly tell us who you are?
My name is Aoife McCullough, and I'm a research fellow at ODI. My question's for Melanie and maybe for Rob. When you were looking at peace agreements, I was wondering, did you notice, were there any factors that facilitated high levels of inclusion working or being part of a sustainable peace agreement? And I guess this gets to maybe the point that Habib was making about Central African Republic, is do we need a well-resourced state or a growing economy to actually sustain inclusion?
Maybe we'll take a couple of questions and then have a joint response. There's another one over here. Thank you, Rob.
Hi there, Rob Palfrey from Minerva Social Risk Management. I just want to go back to that little the conversation we had about the difference between the clockwork and the cloud, and we were talking about it maybe being sequenced. And I just wonder if there's what thoughts are about how that might happen at different levels, from the strategic and the tactical. So, whilst it might be great embracing the complexity up at the strategic level, if you're sat there on the ground trying to do that at the very tactical level, it just becomes paralysis. But that's not to say that perhaps small amounts of clockwork activity sat within that and informed by that cloud-based strategic understanding might well be a different way in which the two fit together, rather than just over a time difference.
Okay,
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Maybe we'll take one more question from here, and then I'll read one from online. Over here. Well, we'll come to you in a second, Marcus. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Jessie Hironisheva. I'm with Active Strategy and at the same time just finished PhD at Oxford. And I was working on Bosnia and the inclusion of war victims in post-war Bosnia. And my question is more about the duration of this inclusive peace. Because when we talk about Bosnia, it's 20 years after the war. Why are we still talking about inclusive peace when maybe we should start talking about social welfare or social policies in that country? And I wonder what's your thinking about, where this inclusive peace stops, so to speak, and maybe more structural reforms should be put in place.
Thank you very much. I read one question from the online audience from Jim, who's asking whether anyone could share some examples where the urgent and the cloud responses have been integrated, or he rephrases by saying where the humanitarian development nexus has yielded specific responses. Are there any examples of where this has worked well? Over to the panel. Some questions were very directly asked of some of the speakers. Melody, do you want to start?
Thank you. In regards to peace agreements and inclusion, sort of what do we see working? I think a good one to turn to is perhaps looking at Northern Ireland, and for both sides of the argument. So related to Northern Ireland and the political power sharing agreement, so at a certain point the Women's Coalition got highly involved, realising that there was going to be no voices of women within what was setting up in the consociational process, which is known to be a highly gendered process, got on board with it, managed to sustain 2 women within the process, and who were very successful in getting a number of elements into the peace agreement, such as dealing with victims' commissions and education, youth projects, and also the civic forums to create more participatory democracy. The element of whether that trickled down has actually yielded lesser results, and we're still not seeing the kind of inclusion that process perhaps should have yielded. On the other hand, some of on the reconciliation side, where there was very formalised provisions, probably one of the most developed reconciliation provisions to date prior to sort of the Colombia Agreement coming out, as really setting out ways funding should come from and what should be happening there. You then end up with the reconciliation, if you want, a peace industry that employs practically 30,000 people with a massive amount of investment going into it. So it's there's 2 sides to it, but it can work. But it does also come to this question of the funding of it, and where do you fund and at what stages, and what is critical. It seems at some stage difficult when you're trying to create growth and trying to alleviate critical problems of poverty, to say, well, we need people to sit and talk to each other and engage in grassroots programs to create greater empathy. But ultimately, that's also, it becomes part of this complex thinking, and where do we sequence it, in the sense that will facilitate workplaces where people can work together. That will facilitate better cross-linkages between communities to create from what's called the cross-cutting ties, that when you look at sort of Varshney in India, where they've been these trade associations and creating these linkages between people tend to be part of then alleviating more of the economic problems or creating more stability on the ground. So there is a tension there, but it's to be addressed. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, just maybe to the point of embracing the complexity, I just would like to refer to one of our tools that we use within the G7 Plus, and also it's a part of the New Deal. I mean, it's something that's good to embrace and to finally understand that, yes, it's not a black and white, it's very complex. But, I mean, when you go to the countries, you come with this perception or pre-identified or kind of, set mindset that, okay, this is what I need to do, this is what I can do, and this is the solution. We try to avoid that by including, a country-led assessment of its own problems. Let the country assess its problem. We call it fragility assessment. So we equip the state itself, the people, the government, the civil society, and the development partners to sit and to see across each of the peace building and state building goals, where is the country? And then the result of that is a kind of a harmonization of understanding, or maybe agreement on the challenges, that these are the challenges, and this is what we need to support. And also just to address this fragmentation of understanding of the problems, because one of the problems that further complicate the situation is that you have tons of development actors, each of them see it in a different ways, and then try to address specific things, and that's create more complexity. So we try to avoid that situation by trying to bring all the actors to agree on one vision and one plan. And that's, the country priorities, where all the donors, all the international community, and humanitarian development all agree on that. This is, something that we need to support, rather than, doing bits and bits of work, what relates to us. And this also needs a lot of work at the country level, as Marcus mentioned. I mean, it's a very fair point that, you're accountable to your taxpayers. But, I mean, we need to change that culture, and we may need to educate, our citizens that getting out of fragility is not over time. It takes decades, and we might need to overcome, this sense of output, just build a school and that's it, my job is done, and it will create results. So we need to think a little bit along this side as well, just to change that narratives of what actually our aim of engagement is in that country.
Alyosha,
Sure.
if you want to come in.
Yeah, no, a couple of quick things. I feel like I might have actually introduced a confusion by equating cloud with humanitarian development, and that's actually my fault, and I think probably not particularly helpful. I think to the question that you raised, Rob, in terms of, and apologies if I've just given you a different name. Was that correct?
Yeah,
No, that was good. Okay. Yeah, tactical versus strategic. Actually, the way I would think of it a little bit more is perhaps in terms of what is the problem that you're trying to solve in a particular context, and is it something that's primarily amenable to is it a logistics problem, for example, or is it something more complex? Is it something that's and I think that's where you're having to that for me would be the primary lens to sort of determine what you're trying to bring to bear, and then. So do we have to come to the question, I think, from Jim online was, do we have examples of Clock and Cloud working together, or humanitarian development? Again, my bad for equating this. So I think on Clock and Cloud, yes, we do, because I mean that's where you have precisely this kind of embedding of problems that are logistically based. I mean, I'm using logistics as an example, but following that kind of notion of clockwork again, but something that is amenable to some sort of sequencing of problems that can be solved to achieve a certain outcome in a quite straightforward way. There are many of those embedded within more complex problems. So I think, that we do see these playing out together. On the humanitarian development, which is actually a slightly different question, I mean, the examples of where we've seen that work better is usually linked to a combination of both a certain flexibility of mindset on the part of operational agencies and simultaneously a flexibility of mindset on the part of the people providing money to those operational agencies. And so, not just because we're in a room with someone from DFID, but where I've seen that work very well was actually in Congo, working with DFID, where we had a lot of change in this was sort of 2004, 2008, a lot of change in circumstances within eastern provinces, and it was possible to shift back and forth from different modalities of operating to adapt to that changed reality. That's actually a very unusual setting, that we had large amounts of pre-programmed funding that could be then reallocated in a much more adaptive way than would normally be the case. Normally, the problem is that we're normally boxed into some very specific forms of funding streams that don't talk to each other, and so then creating that alignment of the sort that Rob was talking about, where you can actually have people working independently but all somehow orchestrated in some way, because there is that kind of high level alignment, that is very, very rare and very, very difficult. And then I did want to come back to something, because I totally agree with Habib, while sort of worrying that actually SLRC's research might undermine this agreement. So on this issue of something you said right at the beginning, actually, was around the outsourcing of service provision to non-state actors undermines state legitimacy. And I have a nasty feeling that SLRC research might say it's a bit more complicated than that, but I'll let you answer that one.
It is more complicated than that. I'll get back to that in a second. But Rob, I just wonder whether you want to come in on some of the questions.
The first one about... Sorry.
Yes.
It's good.
Okay. So on the examples of agreements that led to positive inclusion, so the caveat is this wasn't a traditional peace agreement in the traditional sense, but the National Peace Accord structure in South Africa, for me, was one of the best examples of really positive inclusion, because they basically set up a structure that was local, regional, and national. But more importantly, they assigned the proper jobs basically to the different levels. So peace was going to be built by the local structures. And the regional and national structures had a really pivotal job to play in terms of resourcing and supporting those processes, and probably most importantly, providing them with the political cover they needed to actually engage, to be inclusive at the local level. The questions about sequencing, sort of the second and the fourth question, I think I would echo some of the stuff that's been said about you can think about depth of this aligned intelligence. So early on, you can do a pretty lean kind of systems analysis up front to really say, what are the key dynamics here that you at least don't want to worsen in the tactical short-term response? So I was part of a planning exercise. I've done some work with USAID and with the US Interagency. And one of the things that we did in this planning exercise that was really helpful was the systems analysis basically said to the teams who were engaging in this hypothetical conflict that they had been planning around in ways that didn't worsen some of the underlying dynamics around marginalization, around the conflict between traditional and modern ways of operating. And so it didn't tell anybody at the tactical level what to do, but it basically said to them, to the extent you can, avoid worsening these other dynamics. And then you sort of build from that. And so there's a degree to which that aligned intelligence deepens and is more fluid across the layers. It may have to be mostly predominantly at the tactical level at the outset, but it needs to be sort of spread so there's some alignment across the layers, and it's deepened. And then also there's another dimension to think about, which is pushing the locus of activity or initiation from the external to the internal. And so that thinking needs to be, maybe at first it's very externally driven, it needs to become internally driven. Even if they were to say the same things, which hopefully they would, but that there's a real value in that aligned intelligence being actually domestically driven or domestically led in that. And then on the length of time the Bosnia example is a real sort of hard case in this regard, right? So structures that worked in the early years were dysfunctional and were actually preventing sort of deeper social healing processes from happening. So again, ideally, it's these processes need to be aimed toward not implementing an agreement, which I think was maybe the downfall of some of those structures, because they were about implementing the letters of agreements, versus actually, I think as Melanie said, it's the processes need to be living and breathing. And so how do you transfer that to a process that is more emergent, that's more locally led? So ideally, if you're creating a healthier societal dynamics, right, issues of treatment of minority populations and other things should just become the normal course of a healthy, society, not done to implement a peace agreement. And I think that's where implementing the agreement, it actually retards these things becoming sort of normalized social processes.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more turbo round of questions, not least because I did promise Marcus that we'd take his questions. So maybe there's one here and then to Marcus, and then we go to one more line. Thank you.
First of all, thank you. My name is Lucky. Can you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Lucky and I work in actor strategy. I've recently completed my Master of Law at SOAS as a Chief Evening Scholar for Somalia. And so I'm very interested in what you guys have been discussing. I'm ethnically Somali and was a refugee because of the civil war. And I'm really interested in reconciliation. I think, Habib, you mentioned that reconciliation is a necessary step for fragile and conflict-affected states in order to move on to peace and stability. But my question is, well, what does reconciliation look like? And is it different across different states? And are all states, those fragile states, for example, Somalia, are they ready for reconciliation? And would something like the reconciliation process that occurred in South Africa be something that can be implemented in other countries that have gone through periods of like conflict or authoritarian regime? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Marcus Manuel. I'm a senior research associate here at ODI. I just want to thank the panel. I think the identification of collective intelligence with fragility assessments and the idea of system-owned equals country-owned is actually an extraordinary identity, which I think many of us will go away and ponder further as we think about applying that. I just want to invite the panel to end up by opining on South Sudan. I've just led a project which we've now voluntarily wound up in South Sudan because we realized we were at risk of doing more harm than good, and so we left. But, what were the mistakes? I mean, clearly there was a problem of inclusion, and we've known since 2013 that the state was not an inclusive state, and the fragility assessment was not being run by an inclusive group of people trying to run the fragility assessment. So you have, what do you do when your actors on the other side aren't inclusive, and how do you manage that? So any opine on that? And just a direct question for Marcus, also just as he puzzles how to change the systems in DFID, whether it be useful to make it mandatory to ban the use of log frames in some countries as a way of getting things going. Thank you.
I think those are two big questions, so maybe we go straight to answer. No, we want to hear you answer it, so I'll go straight to Marcus with this question.
And it can be yes or no.
Yes.
I think that would be an interesting experiment, yes. I think the thing that when we're, on the more sort of technical side of both the accountability, both towards the beneficiaries in country, and the populations in country, and then the taxpayer variant of it is leaving the log frame aside, it's just, but also for the issues that we're dealing with, how do we know whether we're traveling in a certain direction through the cloud, right? That also keeps on shifting as we go along, right? And I think that where, again, the log frame and the way that that gets monitored tends to be, highly unuseful in terms of its suggestion of linearity, right? And even if you sort of say, yeah, but that's also something that should be changed all the time, we tend not to do it, right? And again, a log frame is supposed to be underpinned by a theory of change that's supposed to be adapted. And you were setting out earlier various of you of what a good theory of change should do, meaning it's not just, well, we do this, then this happens, because then you're back in a log frame, but it's much more emphasis on the assumptions. And we see that as well in working with offices. That's where it, even though DFID has also been talking and trying to implement and underpin log frames with theories of change to become more sophisticated in how we articulate this, that this is what people struggle the most with, being clear about the assumptions. How do you think one thing is going to lead to the next, and how do you factor in that it may, not be a domino chain, but go into completely unexpected situation, like as Rachel Kleinfeld from Carnegie wrote a few years ago, sailboats, not railways, that we're talking about, and how do you know when to change tack and measure sort of the course. And then you come into ways of measurement that are very different from what we usually do, sort of like outcome mapping or other methodologies of that kind, which we rarely use, but they are, and would, something like Manuel suggests that Marcus suggests would perhaps have the effect on pushing those kind of alternative methods much more forward. I do think on a substantive level that especially, those kind of things that you all said are so important for the topic that we're talking about, of whether peace is, how to make it more sustainable, if it's reconciliation, all these things are incredibly hard to measure. So again, in terms of aid industry and including DFIDs, we have to be able to measure results. Again, if we're saying, and we can make a more convincing case that these things really matter, but then again, how do we show that? How do we measure that, right? But again, I think there are things that are happening now, and inclusion is one of those examples. When we wrote the stability framework last year, we were looking at what the evidence says and try to, again, simplify complexity a bit with it and to tell people this is the kind of stuff we want you to think about. Inclusion popped up everywhere. There is enough evidence to say that societies are sort of more peaceful when lots of groups in society feel more included politically and feel that the power is more distributed evenly. If they have a greater benefit from economic growth and so forth and distribution, and have more of a say and access to grievance mechanisms, all of this, but it's different types of inclusion. And again, given that I said we have so many specialized bits in our organization and the wider aid industry, which is all organized around line ministry thinking, is how do you connect this kind of thinking? And again, log frames don't necessarily help with that.
Thank you. Who wants to go first from the panel? Answering some of those questions.
On South Sudan.
And, yeah. Are you volunteering?
No, well, yeah, not really. I guess, yes. I mean, what made us think it was a state in the first place, I guess, would be the question, right? And that's easy to say with hindsight. But there was I think a lot of external actors from all different degrees of perspective and behavior. We all came in and behaved as if we were operating in a context in which there had been a state for a longer period of time, that had been rooted in some sort of prior social contract. It was a very different setting, and I think this again, going back to something that Habib said, this sense that there's this urgency over external engagement in a post-conflict setting where you just drive towards solutions in a ridiculously short time frame, and solutions that have been already kind of cut and pasted from elsewhere. And I think that blinded people to then be able to sort of engage. So then what does one do with how do you handle inclusivity when you've got a non-inclusive structure? I mean, yeah, sorry, I'll pass that one to other panelists, but I don't know. I mean, I think that is and the trouble is, in that kind of context, what that tends to do is reinforce bad behavior from the rest of us, which is we just go full state substitution at that point. And that also becomes very problematic when 10, 20, 30 years later people say, oh, why weren't we building the state? And, here we are again. So over to the rest of you.
I would just like to react maybe on the question of the reconciliation. How does it look like? And also slightly touch on the South Sudan as well a bit, because it's our member country, and we have to deal with it. First of all, I mean, we don't have any other option than reconciliation. That's the harsh reality. But then on the other hand, we have cases like Somalia, Afghanistan, Yemen, where you have, it's not only civil war, it's more like extremism and stuff like that. And then we have the regional actors which are involved, which further complicates the situation. One of the things that we have seen in these countries is that the role of the regional actors is highly important. And I think this is something, there is a positive notion now in case of my own country, where we had been crying that, this is a regional problem, it's not our problem, terrorism and whatever it is. But, very lately, it's realized that, yes, it is something that we have to address at the regional level. And the same goes to Somalia and, also to some extent to South Sudan as well. There is a need. I mean, I should not be taken as a naive, but this is the only solution as a citizen. I would say that, you need to have that international pressure, where it's the only option that we have to foster the reconciliation and back it by the regional powers as well. And on the other hand, also there is the issue of supporting the state to counter the insurgency. Again, example of Somalia, we had a couple of missions there, and one of the missions, I asked the ministers that whether they have any transition plan where, where the peacekeepers live and then the state and the national police, the army is strengthened to take care of that, except only police training on very small scale. Unfortunately, there wasn't any massive or, substantial program where to enable the state, to counter that insurgency. And we have I would call it successful example of Afghanistan, in 2014, or beyond that, it was assumed that it will become again a failed state, but luckily it didn't, because the state is still, it's actively, countering that insurgency. And then you have to bring that, to pressure that the reconciliation becomes the only viable option. But the other thing is that we miss those opportunities. Sometimes it's very easy, as I earlier mentioned about the case of Afghanistan. In the beginning, even since the Bonn process, we did not take the inclusivity in matter, and that inclusivity was not identified and defined by the local actors, and that's why later on we face a problem. And lastly, on the South Sudan, and also in the case of the fragility assessment, this reinforces, very good point. It reinforces my point that the New Deal was taken to the technical prescription, and that fragility assessment was not. I think it was not owned at the elite level, where you could have. And then as our member countries, we have been recently in conversation with the government where we might able to help them. We have this Council of Eminent Persons, champions of peace who go and promote peace and dialogue. We have also, initiated or offered that, given that offer to the UNSG to help us and maybe to bring some other champions where we can support that reconciliation. We cannot just wait. One of the problems, that's unluckily, I would sort, complain the international community that they tend to isolate the regime. We do not want to engage with this because it's in the problem. If you isolate it, it becomes further. You have to start from somewhere. You have to bring someone, to include. Yes, of course, they're devils, but how can you watch them, fighting? So we from the G7 Plus, this is something that we also mentioned on our platform of the international dialogue. We need international community to help us in this regard. We are ready to go, and we are ready to bring, the actors to the table and see what we can draw the solution. But we do not need to isolate them. I think if we isolate them, they will further suffer. Thank you.
Thank you. Melanie.
Thank you. I just want to add that when you're thinking about reconciliation in particular, and reconciliation, like inclusion, is a sort of very loaded word that's often misunderstood, and sort of there's ways of understanding it, both whether you're considering reconciliation as an outcome or whether reconciliation as a process, and how you deal with either of those, and also whether you consider both political reconciliation and social reconciliation, which are also two different levels. So it's sort of at what level are you addressing reconciliation from the very simple, if you take the simplest definition, if you take from almost an accountancy term, just to reconcile the books, just to make sure that you know what's going on, to sort of what we call the most transformative level of reconciliation, which sort of in behavioral terms would be the sense of the removal of the negation of the other as part of your psychological repertoire. So where you no longer see the stereotyped other, you see the humanity in anybody from the other side of the conflict. And so that society is able to heal their differences, and it becomes so unthinkable to even take arms against that person because you see them as equal to yourself. And how you achieve that process in each societal context is very different, and how different societies have achieved it with different results. So in South Africa, the TRC was successful to some extent, but there were always there's always counter arguments against it. Probably the largest success of it was the fact that it was so highly publicized, or sort of 7,000 witness statements that were sort of massively publicized. The TRC in Haiti, I think they printed 70 copies of the actual report. In the end, most of them were never seen. So there becomes a lot of factors as to what makes these processes successful. Other countries have actually found collective amnesia with moving on and more social reconciliation processes to be successful. So it is a case-by-case basis. Whether it is absolutely necessary in any kind of intractable long-fueled conflict where both parties have long narratives of conflict where their collective memory is tied into a stereotyped other, I don't see that long-term societal or country-level healing is possible without it. But how you achieve it has to be by a case-by-case basis.
Thank you. Rob, I wonder whether you have any final thoughts.
So I would just second what's been said about reconciliation. On South Sudan, just a quick anecdote. Before I came into a mid-year, I was working on a project where we did a systems map of South Sudan, and based on that map, did three years in the future scenarios. And one of the scenarios is actually quite close to what ended up actually happening in South Sudan. So when the civil war started in South Sudan, I was really kind of dumbfounded to hear a lot of people say they were totally taken by surprise by what happened. They never could have predicted this. And it's not that we predicted it. It was just that if you get caught up in the day-to-day drama of those dramatic events around the elections and who's in power, and you miss the deeper social context. And so what we were looking at was not confusing the dramatic events of the independence and the new leadership with the relatively unchanged social dynamics that were at play in South Sudan, and eventually, accounted for a lot of what happened. And then I wanted to just, Marcus raised the issue. I think the question was about how do you know you're on the right path if you're taking this, cloud approach? You don't have a linear log frame to sort of fall back on. And I'd say for us within Omidyar, that's our real big learning edge right now. And there's been a lot of really interesting work. We don't have the answer to this by any means, but I think I'm really kind of encouraged by a lot of the work that's happening around looking at that we need mixed methods to understand impact, that you're not going to get impact from one quantitative measure. You need a basket of evidence. You have to kind of triangulate impact. So you might be an ethnography, some quantitative indicators, and a semantic analysis of speeches that are being made. Looking for different types of impacts at different types of a systems engagement. So you should see evidence that impacts, if the system is taking it up, the system is spreading stuff on its own without people from the outside making it happen. And then we've done a lot with this sort of stage gating idea. So how we've kind of trying to build in checkpoints to say, what are the criteria with it? We should be able to meet by a certain stage of an engagement without being overly formalistic about time, but roughly. And if we aren't meeting those criteria, is it time to exit? And how do you do that responsibly? So it's the mixed methods, it's the different kinds of impacts at different stages, and the stage gating, I think, has been part of where we're seeing some real interesting progress.
Thank you very much, Rob. I'll do a 30-second wrap-up because you've all been extremely patient in us going shamelessly over time. But I just want to pick up on the last few points that have been made with South Sudan as a starting point, but I think they're bigger points, because I think what both Alyosha and Rob have said is that the power of dominant narratives really cannot be underestimated. And I think South Sudan remains such a powerful example of this, that if there is one story that everyone subscribes to, then that can have disastrous consequences in the kind of analysis of looking at a situation. And I take away from that a real kind of mandate for the next phase of the Secure Livelihood Research Consortium, where we have to take many different methods and methodological, not just approaches, but almost research philosophies, and look at problems from very, very different angles to also test ourselves, to test whether we are falling prey to some of the dominant narratives that then allows us not to see things. And in the past, we've had some really surprising findings where some of these linear assumptions have been challenged. For example, this link between service delivery and who does it and state legitimacy and so on. So I take from that really we need to put all our effort, and we will try very hard into really broadening our methodological approaches and our analysis, but also then what exactly are we going to look at? And I think the powerful example I've heard here is that we really don't have a clear understanding of the exact mechanisms of when things happen and how they happen. And this could even be still in the Clockwork realm, but it's certainly true for the cloud. Like if we have a grievance mechanism, but then exactly what would it need to look like that it's still considered fair and inclusive, even if the outcome of the grievance mechanism isn't what the person bringing it forward had hoped for. But if the process is still considered fair, what would it need to look like? Again, that's something that I think we need to really spend some time researching. And indeed, the question of sequencing, when something happens in 1 month, how will it play out a few months later? And can we find ways to measure this and keep tab of this to then create this kind of basket of evidence that has been mentioned a couple of times, and dealing with contradictions that emerge from that? How do we then put that into practical thinking? So there's a huge amount of information that I take away from this, and we'll try very hard to at least pay attention to some of that in the next research phase. I really want to thank the panel. I think it's been fantastic. So thank you all, Yosha, Habib, Melanie, Rob online, and then Marcus from the front line. Thank you very much for making the time. And yes, I can echo Marcus when I say that I think we'll take away a lot from this. And thanks everyone for coming. There will be tea and coffee outside, maybe the odd biscuit, even if you're lucky. So please do stay and continue the conversation and come back next time. Thank you very much. Thanks.